The silver locket burned against Leah Miller's skin as dust swirled around the auction platform, men's hungry eyes appraising her like cattle. 18 years old and already sold twice, she clutched the small pendant hidden beneath her worn calico dress, the only connection to a mother she barely remembered. The year was 1876, and in the unforgiving terrain of Wyoming Territory, a woman alone had few choices. Next up, a fine young woman. Healthy, strong, can cook and clean. Starting bid at $30. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the makeshift square of Hecla, Wyoming, a mining settlement that had sprung up with the discovery of silver in the nearby hills. Leah kept her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to make eye contact with any of the miners, traders, and cowboys gathered around. Her previous owner, a saloon keeper with wandering hands, had sold her contract after she'd broken his finger when he tried to take her locket. 3 years of servitude remained on the indenture papers that had crossed the Atlantic with her from Ireland. The bidding began, voices calling out numbers that determined her fate. 35, 40, 50, $75, a deep voice called from the back. The crowd parted as a tall man stepped forward. Unlike the unwashed miners, he stood straight-backed, his clothes dusty but well-made. A rancher by the look of him. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel came down hard. To Mr. Jackson Reed. Leah felt her stomach twist as the stranger approached, paid his money, and received her papers. She'd learned that men who spent that kind of money expected more than just housekeeping services. "Let's go," he said simply, not touching her but gesturing toward a wagon at the edge of town. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, the wagon bouncing along the rutted trail leading away from Hecla. Jackson Reed sat tall beside her, occasionally glancing her way but offering no conversation. Leah kept one hand protectively over her locket, waiting for the inevitable moment when he would demand she remove it or try to take it himself. The landscape opened into a valley as they crested a hill, revealing a sprawling ranch nestled against the backdrop of the Big Horn Mountains. Several outbuildings surrounded a modest 2-story house, and cattle dotted the pastures that stretched toward the horizon. "Reed Ranch," he finally spoke. "Been working it 5 years now, built it from nothing." Leah remained silent, eyes forward. "You'll have your own room in the house," he continued. "I need someone to cook, clean, and help with the household, nothing more." She couldn't help the bitter laugh that escaped her lips. "That's what the last one said too." Jackson Reed turned to look at her fully for the first time, his blue eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Miss Miller, I bought your contract because I need help running this place. I'm not in the habit of forcing myself on women. You have my word on that." "Your word means nothing to me, Mr. Reed," Leah said, lifting her chin. "Men's words rarely amount to much." To her surprise, he nodded. "Fair enough. Time will have to convince you then." The wagon pulled up to the house, and a middle-aged woman emerged from the door, wiping her hands on an apron. "Mrs. Dawson," Jackson called out. "This is Miss Miller. She'll be taking over the household duties starting tomorrow." The older woman nodded, giving Leah an appraising look that, while not unkind, clearly measured her worth as a worker. "Come on in, girl," Mrs. Dawson said. "I've been cooking and cleaning for Mr. Reed since he started this place, but these old bones need rest. I'm heading back east to live with my daughter next week." Leah climbed down from the wagon, her few possessions in a small sack clutched to her chest. "Get her settled, Mrs. Dawson. Show her the ropes." Jackson didn't look at Leah again as he led the horses toward the barn. The house was simple but larger than Leah had expected. A spacious kitchen dominated the rear, with a sitting room and small study at the front. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, one of which would be hers. Mr. Reed's a fair man, Mrs. Dawson said as she showed Lee to a small but clean room. Keeps to himself mostly. Works harder than any 3 men I've ever known. Why did he buy a contract? Lee asked. Couldn't he have hired someone local? Mrs. Dawson shook her head. Not many women out here willing to live this far from town. And he won't marry just for convenience, though plenty have tried to catch his eye. Lee absently touched her locket through her dress, a habit she'd developed over the years. The motion didn't escape Mrs. Dawson's notice. What's that you're guarding, girl? Nothing, Lee said quickly, dropping her hand. Well, whatever it is, it's yours to keep. Mr. Reed isn't one to take what isn't freely given. That night, Lee lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, fingers wrapped around her locket. Inside was a tiny portrait of her mother, and a lock of her hair, the only remnant of the woman who had died on the crossing from Ireland when Lee was just 5. Her father had signed the indenture papers 2 years later before disappearing to the goldfields of California, never to be heard from again. Morning came early on the ranch. By the time Lee made her way downstairs, Jackson Reed had already been out working for hours. She found Mrs. Dawson in the kitchen, teaching her the routine: bread to be baked, meals to prepare, washing schedules, and the 100 other tasks that kept the ranch house functioning. The days passed in a blur of work. Mrs. Dawson left at the end of the week, and suddenly Lee was alone in the house, responsible for everything. To her surprise, Jackson Reed proved to be exactly as promised: fair, distant, and respectful of her space. He took meals at regular times, thanked her for her work, and never once entered her room or made inappropriate comments. Most surprising of all, he never mentioned the locket that she unconsciously touched whenever she was nervous or thinking of her past. Other men had demanded she remove it, suspicious of what or who might be inside. But Jackson Reed seemed content to let her keep her secrets. As spring turned to summer, Lee settled into a rhythm at the ranch. She learned the patterns of the seasons, the needs of the household, and gradually, the character of the quiet man who owned it all. Jackson worked from dawn until dusk, managing his growing herd, training horses, and improving the property. Sometimes ranch hands would come to help with bigger tasks, but mostly he worked alone. One evening in July, as Lee served dinner, a sudden thunderstorm broke overhead, rattling the windows with its fury. Jackson had just finished eating when a panicked pounding came at the door. "Boss." A young ranch hand stood dripping on the porch. "Lightning spooked the horses in the north pasture. They've broken through the fence." Without a word, Jackson grabbed his coat and hat. He paused at the door, looking back at Lee. "Don't wait up. This might take all night." Hours later, Lee was awakened by the sound of the front door opening. She crept downstairs to find Jackson collapsed in a chair, soaked to the bone, mud covering his clothes. A deep gash ran across his forehead, blood mixing with rainwater down his face. "Mr. Reed," she hurried to his side. "You're hurt." "Got thrown," he muttered. "Horse spooked at another lightning strike. Got all the others back, though." Lee fetched water, clean cloths, and the bottle of whiskey Jackson kept in the kitchen cabinet. She cleaned the wound gently, aware of his eyes watching her as she worked. "You should get out of these wet clothes before you catch your death," she said, finishing with a bandage across his forehead. "Are you offering to help with that, Miss Miller?" The corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Lee stepped back immediately, her hand going to her locket. "I didn't." "That was a poor attempt at humor," Jackson said quickly, regret flashing in his eyes. "Forgive me, I'm not thinking clearly." He stood, swaying slightly from exhaustion. "Thank you for your help. I can manage the rest." As he climbed the stairs, Lee noticed how he favored his right leg, wincing with each step. The man was more injured than he let on, but too proud to admit it. The next morning, Jackson was already gone when she woke, despite his injuries. Lee found herself worrying about him throughout the day, checking the window for his return more often than necessary. When he finally rode in that evening, she felt an unexpected relief. "Sit," she commanded when he entered, pointing to the kitchen chair. "Let me check that wound." To her surprise, he obeyed without argument. As she removed the bandage, she noticed the lines of pain around his eyes, the way he held himself too rigidly. "You're hurting elsewhere," she observed. "Your ribs," Jackson nodded reluctantly. "Got kicked when I went down. Nothing's broken." "You don't know that," Lee said, her tone sharper than intended. "You need a doctor." "Nearest doctor's in Sheridan, 2 days' ride, I'll heal." Lee sighed in frustration. "At least let me wrap your ribs, and you're staying inside tomorrow." "Are you giving me orders on my own ranch, Miss Miller?" There was no anger in his voice, only a hint of amusement. "Someone needs to exercise some sense around here," she replied, surprised by her own boldness. That night, after wrapping his ribs tightly with strips of clean linen, Lee found herself unable to sleep. She went downstairs to make some tea and was startled to find Jackson sitting in the dark, staring out the window at the moonlit pastures. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked without turning. "The storm has my nerves unsettled," she lied, not wanting to admit she'd been thinking about him. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Join me," Lee hesitated, then sat. For several minutes they remained in comfortable silence. "Why did you really buy my contract, Mr. Reed?" she finally asked. Jackson turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Truthfully, I saw how you stood on that auction block, head high, eyes forward, refusing to look beaten even when most would have broken. I respected that." His answer surprised her. "Most men wouldn't spend good money on respect." "I'm not most men." He shifted, wincing at the movement. "Besides, I told you I needed help with the ranch. There are easier ways to find help than buying an indentured woman." "Perhaps." Jackson's eyes drifted to her neck, where the chain of her locket was just visible above her collar. "We all have our reasons for the choices we make. Some we share, some we keep close." Lee's hand instinctively went to the locket. "You don't have to explain it to me," he said softly. "Whatever's in there is yours." The weeks that followed changed something between them. Jackson began taking his meals more slowly, engaging Lee in conversation about the ranch, asking her opinion on improvements to the house. She found herself looking forward to these moments, learning about the quiet man who had purchased her freedom without demanding anything in return. One afternoon in late August, Lee was hanging laundry when 3 riders approached the ranch. Jackson walked out to meet them, his stance immediately tense. From her position, she couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw one of the men gesture angrily, pointing toward the northern pasture. The argument escalated, voices raising. The largest of the 3 men dismounted, stepping aggressively toward Jackson. Before she could think better of it, Lee dropped the laundry and hurried across the yard, a rifle she'd taken from beside the door held firmly in her hands. "Is there a problem, Mr. Reed?" she asked, stopping a few paces away, the rifle not raised but clearly visible. Jackson didn't take his eyes off the man before him. "No problem, Miss Miller. These gentlemen were just leaving." The 3 men looked at Lee, then at the rifle. The leader spat on the ground. "This ain't over, Reed. That water belongs to the Blackburn Ranch, and you know it." "The water rights were included in my deed," Jackson replied evenly. "Take it up with the territorial office if you disagree." The men mounted up, the leader giving one final threat. "You'd best watch yourself. Accidents happen to lone ranchers all the time." Once they were gone, Jackson turned to Lee, his expression a mixture of amusement and concern. "Were you planning to shoot them, Miss Miller?" if necessary, she replied, surprised at her own resolve. Though I've never fired a rifle before. A laugh escaped him, the first real laugh she'd heard from the man. Then I'm especially glad it didn't come to that. Come inside, I think we both could use some coffee. At the kitchen table, Jackson explained the situation. The Blackburn Ranch has been trying to push me out since I arrived. They've been the big operation in this valley for 20 years, and they don't appreciate the competition. Will they really try to hurt you? Lee asked, still clutching the rifle. Jackson shrugged. They've been making threats for years. So far, it's just talk. He reached across the table, gently taking the rifle from her hands. Thank you for coming to my aid, though. It was brave, if somewhat reckless. His fingers brushed against hers, and Lee felt an unexpected warmth spread through her. She pulled away quickly, confused by her reaction. I should finish the laundry, she said, standing abruptly. That night, as she readied for bed, Lee opened her locket for the first time in months. The tiny portrait of her mother stared back at her, a woman barely older than Lee was now when she died. She had always imagined her mother watching over her, protecting her from the hardships of life. But lately, when she thought of protection and safety, it was Jackson Reed's face that came to mind. The realization troubled her. Getting attached to her employer, her owner, technically, until the indenture was complete was dangerous. Men changed, promises were broken, and hearts were shattered in the aftermath. The locket was her reminder of that truth. The only person she could truly count on was herself. Autumn brought a flurry of activity to the ranch as Jackson prepared for winter. Hay was cut and stored, cattle were moved to sheltered pastures, and the house was weatherproofed against the coming cold. Lee found herself working alongside Jackson more often, learning aspects of ranch life beyond her household duties. You've got a good eye for the stock, he commented one evening as they returned from checking on a pregnant heifer. You can tell which ones are going to give us trouble at calving time. My grandmother raised dairy cows in Ireland, Lee said. I used to help her before. She trailed off, not wanting to revisit the famine years that had ultimately led to their emigration. Jackson seemed to understand. Some memories are better left undisturbed. The first snow came in October, earlier than expected. Lee woke to a world transformed, the familiar landscape now blanketed in white. She watched from the kitchen window as Jackson trudged through knee-deep drifts to check on the animals, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. When he returned, stomping snow from his boots, his face was red from cold, but his eyes were bright with exhilaration. Nothing like the first real snow to make you feel alive. Lee handed him a cup of coffee. Or frozen. He laughed, accepting the mug gratefully. Their fingers touched in the exchange, and this time neither pulled away immediately. Something shifted in Jackson's expression, a softening around his eyes that made Lee's heart beat faster. The moment was interrupted by a crash from the barn, followed by the panicked whinnying of horses. Jackson set down the coffee and was out the door in an instant, Lee close behind him. In the barn, they found chaos. A section of the roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow, sending timbers and debris onto the stalls below. 2 horses were trapped, thrashing in panic. Get the rope from my saddle, Jackson ordered, already moving toward the first horse. Working together, they calmed and freed the animals, checking them for injuries. As Lee held the lantern, Jackson examined the damaged roof. It's worse than I thought, he muttered. The whole section will need to be rebuilt before the next storm. Can it be done in time? Jackson shook his head. Not alone. I'll have to ride to town tomorrow, see if I can hire some men to help. In this snow, it's too dangerous, Lee protested. I don't have a choice. The animals need shelter. The argument continued back at the house, Lee insisting he wait for the trails to clear. Jackson equally adamant about leaving at first light. Finally, in frustration, he threw up his hands. "Why do you even care what happens to me, Miss Miller? In less than a year, your contract will be fulfilled and you'll be free to leave this place." The question caught Lee off guard. Why did she care? When had this man's welfare become so important to her? "I care because—" She started, then stopped, uncertain how to continue. Jackson stepped closer, his voice softening. Because you've been kind to me when you didn't have to be," she finally said. "That deserves something in return." Something like disappointment flickered across his face. "I see." He moved toward the door. "I'll check the trail conditions in the morning before deciding." Alone in the kitchen, Lee pressed her hand against her locket, trying to sort through the confusion of her feelings. She had spent years guarding her heart, keeping people at a distance to avoid the pain of loss. But somehow, Jackson Reed had slipped past those defenses. The next morning, Jackson announced he would wait one day for the main trails to be cleared by other travelers. Lee hid her relief behind a practical nod as she served breakfast. They spent the day securing the barn as best they could, moving the horses to the undamaged section. Working side by side, Lee became acutely aware of Jackson, the strength in his hands as he lifted heavy beams, the concentration in his expression as he measured and planned, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled at something she said. That evening, with the wind howling outside, they sat before the fire in the sitting room. Jackson was sketching plans for the barn repairs while Lee mended a tear in one of his shirts. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly. How comfortable it felt, how right. "You're quiet tonight," Jackson observed, glancing up from his papers. "Just thinking," she replied. "About?" Lee hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind for months. "Why haven't you ever asked about my locket?" Jackson set down his pencil. "Would you have told me if I had?" "Probably not," she admitted. "Then there's your answer." He leaned back in his chair. "Some things aren't meant to be shared until a person is ready. I figured you'd tell me when and if you wanted to." The simplicity of his respect moved her deeply. Before she could reconsider, Lee reached up and unclasped the locket from around her neck, the first time she had willingly removed it in over a decade. She held it out to him. Jackson took it carefully, as if handling something precious. He opened it, studied the tiny portrait inside, then closed it again before returning it to her palm. "Your mother?" he asked softly. Lee nodded. "She died on the ship coming over from Ireland. Fever took her. I was 5. Her fingers closed around the locket. It's all I have left of her." Jackson's hand covered hers, warm and steady. "Thank you for showing me." "Everyone else tried to take it from me," she whispered. "Every man who's owned my contract has demanded I remove it, sell it, or give it to them as a payment of sorts." Anger flashed in Jackson's eyes. "You are not a possession, Lee, contract or no contract." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it sent a tremor through her. "When I bought your papers," he continued, "it wasn't to own you. It was to give you a safe place until you could be free again. And after that—" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "After that is your choice," Jackson said, his gaze holding hers. "Always your choice." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Lee slipped the locket back around her neck, her fingers lingering on the chain. "I should finish this mending," she said quietly. Jackson nodded, returning to his sketches. But something had changed. A door opened that couldn't be closed again. The next day, Jackson left for town as planned. What should have been a day's journey stretched into 3 as another storm moved through the region. Lee found herself pacing the house, checking the trail from the upstairs window every hour, worry gnawing at her. On the evening of the 3rd day, just as darkness was falling, she spotted movement on the trail. Relief flooded through her as Jackson's familiar figure emerged from the trees, followed by 3 other riders and a wagon loaded with lumber. She ran outside without a coat, heedless of the cold. Jackson dismounted stiffly, his face drawn with exhaustion but breaking into a smile when he saw her. "Worried about me, Miss Miller?" he asked, his tone teasing but his eyes serious. "The coffee's getting cold," she replied, trying to mask her emotion. "And these men will need feeding." The barn repairs began the next morning. The hired men brothers from a neighboring ranch worked efficiently under Jackson's direction. By the end of the week, the structure was sound again, stronger than before. On the final evening, after the brothers had returned to their own ranch, promising to come back if needed, Jackson and Lee stood in the newly repaired barn, inspecting the work. "It should hold through anything now," he said with satisfaction. "Thank you for your help this week." "I couldn't have managed without you." "I only brought food and coffee," Lee demurred. "You did far more than that." Jackson turned to face her fully. "You've made this place a home, Lee. Before you came, it was just a house where I slept between working." The sincerity in his voice made her heart race. She looked away, afraid of what he might see in her eyes. "There's a dance in town next weekend," he said suddenly. "The harvest celebration. Would you like to go?" The unexpected invitation surprised her. "A dance together." "Well, we'd ride there together," he clarified quickly. "But you'd be free to dance with whoever you choose." "I don't know how to dance," Lee admitted. "Not the American ways." Jackson's smile was gentle. "I could teach you if you'd like." That night, after dinner was cleared away, Jackson moved the furniture in the sitting room to create an open space. He wound the gramophone that had been his one luxury purchase the year before, and soft music filled the room. "It's simple," he said, holding out his hand to her. "Just follow my lead." Hesitantly, Lee placed her hand in his. Jackson drew her closer, positioning her other hand on his shoulder while his rested lightly at her waist. The respectable distance between them did nothing to calm the fluttering in her stomach. "Now just step like this," he demonstrated, moving slowly. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Lee stumbled at first, unaccustomed to following another's movements so closely. But gradually she found the rhythm, her body relaxing as they moved around the small space. "You're a natural," Jackson murmured, his eyes never leaving hers. "I stepped on your foot twice," she countered with a smile. "Details." He spun her gently, bringing her back into his arms with surprising grace for a man who spent most of his days on horseback. As the music continued, they moved closer together, the proper dance form gradually giving way to something more intimate. Lee could feel the steady beat of Jackson's heart, the warmth of his hand at her waist. When the song ended, neither moved away immediately. "Lee," Jackson's voice was low, a question in her name. She looked up at him, suddenly afraid not of him, but of the feelings threatening to overwhelm her carefully constructed defenses. "I should check on the bread for tomorrow," she said, stepping back abruptly. Jackson let her go without protest, but she felt his eyes follow her from the room. In the kitchen, Lee pressed her hands against the cool surface of the table, trying to steady her breathing. Her locket seemed heavier than usual against her skin, a reminder of all she had lost and all she feared to lose again. The day of the dance arrived, bringing clear skies and mild weather for November. Lee spent extra time preparing, washing her hair and putting on her one good dress, a deep green wool that Mrs. Dawson had insisted on giving her before departing. It was slightly large but finer than anything Lee had owned before. When she came downstairs, Jackson was waiting by the door. He had shaved, his usually wind-roughened face smooth, his dark hair neatly combed. His clothes, while simple, were clean and pressed the work of Lee's own hands the day before. "You look beautiful," he said simply, his eyes warm with appreciation. The ride to town was filled with a nervous energy, their conversation more stilted than it had been in months. Lee found herself touching her locket frequently, drawing comfort from its familiar presence. Hecla had changed since Lee had last seen it. New buildings had sprung up, and the small settlement was beginning to resemble a proper town. The dance was being held in the newly constructed town hall, a large wooden building at the center of the community. Inside, lanterns cast a golden glow over the gathered crowd. A small band played in one corner, and couples were already dancing. Lee felt suddenly self-conscious, aware of curious glances from the townspeople. "That's Liam Blackburn," Jackson murmured, nodding toward a heavy-set man holding court near the refreshments. "Owner of Blackburn Ranch." The younger one beside him is his son, Thomas. Lee recognized the son as one of the three men who had threatened Jackson months earlier. His gaze landed on them, narrowing with recognition and dislike. "Perhaps this wasn't a good idea," she whispered. "Nonsense," Jackson replied, offering his arm. "We have as much right to be here as anyone." He led her to the dance floor just as the band started a waltz, the very dance he had taught her. Lee followed his lead, more confident now but still conscious of the eyes watching them. "Everyone's staring," she said under her breath. "Let them," Jackson replied, his hand warm against her back. "They're just surprised to see me socializing. I've developed something of a reputation as a hermit." As the evening progressed, Lee began to relax. Other men asked her to dance, which she accepted after a reassuring nod from Jackson. She learned that most of the townsfolk knew little about her beyond rumors, that Jackson Reed had bought himself a woman gossip that made her cheeks burn with indignation. "It doesn't matter what they think," Jackson told her during a break from dancing as they stood by the refreshment table. "We know the truth." "And what is the truth, Mr. Reed?" she asked, emboldened by the evening's festivities. Before he could answer, Thomas Blackburn approached, his expression unpleasant. "Reed," he acknowledged coldly before turning to Lee with an appraising look. "Madam, Thomas Blackburn, may I have the next dance?" Jackson tensed beside her but remained silent, leaving the choice to Lee. For a moment, she considered refusing, but curiosity about this rival family won out. "One dance," she agreed, not missing the flash of surprise in Jackson's eyes. Thomas Blackburn proved to be a competent dancer but lacked the natural grace Jackson possessed. As they moved across the floor, he leaned closer than propriety dictated. "A pretty thing like you shouldn't be wasting away on Reed's sorry excuse for a ranch," he said. "My father's operation is 10 times the size with a proper house, not that falling-down cabin Reed calls home." "I find Mr. Reed's home quite comfortable," Lee replied coldly. Thomas laughed. "I'll bet you do. Tell me, did he buy you for cooking or warming his bed?" Lee's hand itched to slap him, but she controlled herself. "Mr. Reed is a gentleman, which is clearly more than can be said for you." "He won't last the winter," Thomas continued as if she hadn't spoken. "That North Water dispute isn't settled and my father doesn't lose. When Reed's gone, you'll need a new position. I could use a housekeeper." His hand slid lower on her back. "Among other things." Lee stopped dancing abruptly. "Remove your hand, Mr. Blackburn." "Or what?" he sneered. "Or I'll remove it for you." Jackson's voice came from just behind them, quiet but filled with controlled anger. Thomas turned, his expression darkening. "This is a private conversation, Reed." "It's over now," Jackson replied, offering his arm to Lee. "Miss Miller," she took his arm gratefully, but Thomas grabbed her other wrist. "We're not finished." He never completed the sentence. Jackson's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling onto the dance floor. The music stopped abruptly as gasps filled the room. "Touch her again, and I won't stop at one punch," Jackson said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. Liam Blackburn pushed through the crowd, helping his son to his feet. "You've made a serious mistake, Reed. Nobody lays hands on my boy." "Your boy put his hands where they didn't belong," Jackson replied evenly. "He's lucky I didn't break them." The elder Blackburn's face reddened with fury. "This isn't over. It is for tonight." Jackson turned to Lee. "I think it's time we left." The ride home was tense, Jackson's anger still radiating from him in waves. Lee had never seen him so affected, his normally calm demeanor replaced by a tightly controlled rage. "I'm sorry," she finally said as the ranch came into view. "For what?" He sounded genuinely confused. "For dancing with him, for causing a scene." Jackson reined in his horse, turning to look at her. "You have nothing to apologize for. Blackburn was out of line, not you. Still, I shouldn't have." Lee. The way he said her name stopped her words. "You can dance with whoever you choose. That's your right. But no man gets to disrespect you, especially not." He trailed off. "Especially not what?" Jackson's eyes held hers in the moonlight. "Especially not when you're under my protection." The words hung between them, loaded with meanings neither was ready to fully acknowledge. The winter that followed was one of the harshest in memory. Snow piled in drifts higher than the fences, and temperatures dropped so low that the creek froze solid. Despite the cold outside, the atmosphere within the house grew warmer, the dance incident having broken through some invisible barrier between them. They spent evenings by the fire, Jackson reading aloud from books he ordered from back east, Lee working on quilts and mending. Sometimes they danced to the gramophone, Lee growing more confident in her steps. Other times they simply talked, sharing pieces of their lives before Wyoming. Lee learned that Jackson had come west after the war, unable to settle back into his former life in Pennsylvania after what he'd seen. He'd worked as a cowhand on various ranches, saving every penny until he could buy his own land. The ranch represented not just his livelihood, but his redemption, a place where he could build something positive after years of destruction. In turn, she told him more about Ireland, about the grandmother who had taught her to cook and sew, about the devastating famine that had taken so many, including her father's will to stay and fight. She spoke of the Atlantic crossing, of holding her mother's hand as the fever took her, of the locket being pressed into her palm with whispered words she could barely remember. "Never forget where you come from. Is that why you guard it so carefully?" Jackson asked one evening as they sat closer than usual, sharing a blanket against the particularly bitter cold. "To remember your origins," Lee nodded, her fingers finding the familiar shape beneath her dress. "That, and because it's the only thing that's truly mine. Every master I've had tried to take it, some by force, others by coercion. Keeping it became a way of keeping myself." Jackson's hand covered hers, warm and steady. "It will always be yours, Lee, along with whatever else you choose to claim." His words carried a deeper meaning that sent warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire or the blanket. Their faces were close, his eyes searching hers with a question he wouldn't voice without invitation. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Jackson leaned forward. His lips met hers in a kiss so gentle, it brought tears to her eyes, not a taking but a giving. Lee responded hesitantly at first, then with growing certainty, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek. When they parted, Jackson pressed his forehead to hers. "I've wanted to do that since the day you brought me that rifle to face down Blackburn's men." Lee laughed softly. "That longer," he admitted, "but that's when I knew for certain. The moment was perfect, suspended in time like a snowflake before it touches earth." Then reality intruded as it always did. The clock chimed 9, breaking the spell. "It's getting late," Lee said reluctantly. Jackson nodded, though neither made a move to separate. Lee, I need you to know something. Your contract, it doesn't matter to me. When spring comes and your time is served, I want you to choose freely what happens next. And if I choose to stay, she asked, her heart pounding, his eyes darkened with emotion, then you would make me the happiest man in Wyoming Territory. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But not as my housekeeper. The implication was clear, and it both thrilled and frightened her. Marriage, a life together, not as master and servant, but as partners. I need time, she whispered. You have it, he replied simply. As much as you need. January brought blizzards that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Jackson and Lee fell into a new rhythm, their relationship altered by the acknowledgement of feelings between them, but not yet defined by any formal commitment. They shared kisses by the fire, held hands as they worked side by side. But Jackson never pressed for more, respecting the boundaries Lee maintained. February came, and with it, trouble. The cattle were struggling in the deep snow, forcing Jackson to spend long hours ensuring they had access to feed. Twice, wolves came too close to the weakened herd, and Jackson returned home with the grim evidence of having defended his livestock. One morning, as Lee prepared breakfast, she noticed smoke rising from the direction of the north pasture. Jackson saw it too, grabbing his coat and rifle. Stay here, he ordered, more sharply than he'd spoken to her in months. What is it? Don't know yet, but that's not a controlled burn. His expression was grave. Bar the door behind me. If I'm not back in 2 hours, take the small horse and ride for town. Before she could protest, he was gone, riding hard toward the smoke. Lee paced the house anxiously, checking the clock every few minutes. The prescribed 2 hours came and went, and still no sign of Jackson. Just as she was preparing to saddle the horse as instructed, she spotted riders approaching, 3 of them, none Jackson. With a sinking heart, she recognized Thomas Blackburn among them. Quickly, Lee retrieved the rifle from beside the door, checking that it was loaded as Jackson had taught her. She positioned herself by the window, watching as the men dismounted and approached the house. Miss Miller, Thomas called, we've come with news about Reed. She didn't respond, keeping the rifle ready. There's been an accident, he continued. Reed's hurt bad. He sent us to fetch you. Lee's heart clenched, but suspicion kept her from opening the door. Jackson would never send the Blackburns for her. Where is he? She called through the door. North pasture. The line shack caught fire and he was trapped inside for a spell. Burns and smoke got to him. The story was plausible. The smoke she'd seen could have been the line shack, but something in Thomas's tone rang false. I'll ride out myself, she replied. No time. The false concern in his voice slipped, revealing impatience. He needs help now. Open up. When she didn't respond, the pretense dropped entirely. Thomas slammed his fist against the door. Open this door or we'll break it down. Reed's not coming back, we made sure of that. Now you can come easy or we can drag you out. Terror and rage warred within Lee. If they were telling the truth about harming Jackson. She steeled herself, raising the rifle to her shoulder. I'm armed, she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. And I know how to use this. A laugh came from outside. She's bluffing. Kick it in, boys. The door shuddered under a powerful blow. Lee aimed at the wood panel where the sound had come from and fired. A cry of pain told her she'd hit something. You bitch, Thomas shouted. You'll pay for that. More blows rained against the door, the wood beginning to splinter. Lee moved to the window, thinking to escape that way, when the sound of galloping hooves drew everyone's attention. Jackson appeared at the edge of the yard, rifle raised, face streaked with soot but very much alive. Step away from my house, Blackburn. The men outside scattered for cover. one limping badly, the recipient of Lee's shot. Gunfire erupted, bullets splintering the wood around the windows. Lee ducked low, crawling toward the kitchen where the back door offered a possible escape. The gunfire continued outside, punctuated by shouts and the whinnying of frightened horses. Lee reached the back door just as it burst open, revealing Thomas Blackburn, his face twisted with malice. "Thought you could hide," he snarled, grabbing for her. Lee swung the empty rifle like a club, catching him across the face. He staggered but didn't fall, lunging for her again. They grappled, Lee fighting with the desperation of someone who knew what capture would mean. Her hand found a cast iron skillet on the stove, and she brought it down hard on Thomas's head. This time, he crumpled to the floor. Breathing hard, Lee stepped over his unconscious form and peered outside. Jackson was exchanging fire with the remaining men from behind the water trough. As she watched, one of the attackers fell, clutching his shoulder. The last man, standing one of the hands from Blackburn Ranch, apparently decided the odds had turned against them. He mounted his horse and fled, leaving his wounded companions behind. Lee rushed to Jackson's side as he emerged from cover. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing serious," he replied, though she could see blood seeping through his shirt at the shoulder. "Blackburn, unconscious in the kitchen," she reported. "I hit him with a skillet." Despite the gravity of the situation, Jackson laughed. "Remind me never to cross you in the kitchen." His expression sobered as he surveyed the damage to the house. "They'll be back and in greater numbers. We need to get to town, report this to the sheriff." "What about him?" Lee nodded toward the house where Thomas lay. "We'll take him with us. Evidence of their attack." They worked quickly, binding Thomas's hands and loading him onto his own horse. Jackson retrieved the wounded man from the yard alive, but in no condition to cause further trouble, and secured him as well. As they prepared to leave, Jackson paused, looking back at the ranch. "I'm sorry, Lee. I never meant to put you in danger." She touched his arm gently. "This isn't your fault." Blackburn set fire to the line shack as a distraction, he explained, his voice tight with anger. "They meant to take you while I was gone if I hadn't circled back when I did." "But you did," she reminded him, "and I wasn't entirely helpless." The pride in his eyes warmed her despite the chill of the day. "No, you certainly weren't." The journey to Hecla took longer than usual with their wounded prisoners. By the time they reached town, word of the confrontation had somehow preceded them, drawing curious onlookers as they rode to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller, no relation to Lee, despite sharing her surname, listened to their account with growing concern. Thomas Blackburn, now conscious and sullen, remained defiantly silent, refusing to explain his actions. "This is serious business," the sheriff said when they'd finished. "Attempted murder, arson, kidnapping. Liam Blackburn has influence, but even he can't make this go away." "He'll try," Jackson warned. "Stay in town tonight," the sheriff advised. "I'll send deputies out to your ranch to secure the place. The hotel has rooms available." Too exhausted to argue, Jackson and Lee accepted the suggestion. At the small hotel, however, they encountered an unexpected problem. "Just one room left," the clerk informed them apologetically. "With the cattle buyers in town for the early spring auctions." Jackson glanced at Lee, clearly uncomfortable. "We'll find other arrangements." "It's fine," Lee said quietly. "I trust you." The room was small but clean, with a single bed, washstand, and chair. Jackson immediately claimed the chair. "I'll sleep here, you take the bed." Lee began to protest, but the exhaustion etched on his face stopped her. His wound, while not life-threatening, had clearly taken a toll. "At least let me check your shoulder first," she insisted. As she helped him remove his shirt, Lee was struck by the intimacy of the moment, not improper, but deeply personal nonetheless. The bullet had grazed his shoulder, leaving an angry furrow that she cleaned carefully with water from the basin. "You could have been killed," she said softly as she worked. "So could you." His hand captured hers, stilling her movements. "When I realized what they were planning." "Lee, I've never been so frightened. Not even during the war. That was different. Then I was only risking my own life." His eyes held hers, filled with emotions too powerful to name. "Today, I stood to lose everything that matters." The truth of his words resonated in her own heart. Somewhere along the way, this man had become her world, not through ownership or obligation, but through countless small kindnesses, through respect freely given, through love that asked nothing in return. "Jackson," she whispered, her free hand moving to the locket at her throat. For the first time, its presence felt not like a shield, but like a bridge between her past and the future unfolding before her. "I don't want to lose you either." He drew her closer, his kiss carrying all the fear and relief of the day, all the longing of months spent growing toward each other. When they finally parted, the decision that had seemed so daunting before was suddenly crystal clear. "When we go home," Lee said, her voice steady with certainty, "I'm staying, not as your housekeeper, not because of any contract, but because I choose you, Jackson Reed, I choose us." The joy that transformed his face was worth every hardship she had endured to reach this moment. "Are you certain? Your indenture isn't officially complete until April." "I'm certain," she replied, smiling. "Besides, I think saving your life today should count for something toward my remaining time." He laughed, then winced as the movement aggravated his wound. "More than something. Everything." That night, despite his protests, they shared the narrow bed, Jackson above the covers, Lee beneath them, a concession to propriety that seemed both ridiculous and necessary. They fell asleep holding hands, the day's dangers giving way to dreams of the future. The next morning brought the sheriff with news. Liam Blackburn had been arrested upon trying to organize men to rescue his son. With both Blackburns in custody and multiple witnesses to their crimes, the threat they posed seemed finally contained. "The territorial judge arrives next month," Sheriff Miller informed them. "They'll stand trial then. In the meantime, you're welcome to return to your ranch. I've posted deputies there, and they report everything is secure." The ride home was filled with plans and possibilities. Without the Blackburn threat hanging over them, the future stretched wide open. "We should rebuild the barn properly come spring," Jackson said as they crested the hill overlooking the ranch. "Make it twice the size. I'm thinking of expanding the herd." "The house could use expansion too," Lee suggested. "Perhaps another bedroom or two." Jackson glanced at her, a question in his eyes that made her blush. "For guests," she clarified, "and perhaps eventually for family." His smile was radiant. "I'd like that very much." The ranch house, despite the damage from the attack, had never looked more beautiful to Lee's eyes. This was home now, not because she was bound by contract, but because she had chosen it freely. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Jackson took her hand. "There's something I've been meaning to give you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He produced a small wooden box, clearly handmade, the wood polished to a soft sheen. "I carved this during those long winter evenings. It's for your locket, a proper place to keep it when you're not wearing it." Lee opened the box to find a velvet-lined interior perfectly sized for her locket. The thoughtfulness of the gift brought tears to her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like its owner," Jackson replied. He hesitated, then continued. "Lee, I know it's not been long since you made your choice, and we've had little time to simply be together without danger or obligation between us. But I've known my heart for months now." He shifted from the chair to kneel before her, still holding her hand. I love you, Leah Miller. Not as a man who purchased a contract, but as a man who found his other half when he least expected it. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Joy bubbled up within her, bright and unstoppable. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will. Jackson's kiss sealed the promise between them, a pledge more binding than any paper contract could ever be. The wedding took place in April, just days after Lee's indenture officially ended. The small church in Hecla was filled with well-wishers, neighboring ranchers, townsfolk who had come to respect Jackson's quiet determination, even Mrs. Dawson, who traveled from back east for the occasion. Lee wore a new dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from Denver. Around her neck, the locket lay open for the first time, displaying her mother's portrait for all to see, no longer a secret to guard, but a cherished piece of history to share. Judge Parker, who had come to town for the Blackburn trial, resulting in lengthy prison sentences for both father and son, performed the ceremony. As he pronounced them husband and wife, Lee felt the final pieces of her life sliding perfectly into place. At the small reception held at the hotel, Mrs. Dawson cornered her with a knowing smile. I told you he was a good man, didn't I? Knew it from the moment he bought your contract, with no lecherous intent in his eyes, just need for someone to make that house a home. You were right, Lee agreed, watching Jackson across the room as he accepted congratulations from the sheriff. Though I didn't believe it at first. Few would have, the older woman acknowledged. You've both been blessed to find each other. That night, returning to the ranch as husband and wife, Lee and Jackson stood in the doorway of their home, taking in the familiar space that now held new meaning. Welcome home, Mrs. Reed, Jackson said softly. Lee touched her locket, the treasured connection to her past now joined by the wedding band that symbolized her future. I am home, she replied. I think perhaps I have been since the day you never asked me to remove this. I never would have, he assured her. Some things are sacred. As is this, she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. As is us. In the years that followed, the Reed Ranch prospered, expanding as Jackson had planned. The house grew too, with the addition of a larger kitchen, a proper study, and eventually 3 new bedrooms for the children who came to fill their lives with joy and noise, 2 boys and a girl, each with their mother's determination and their father's quiet strength. Lee continued to wear her locket, though now it contained 2 portraits, her mother on one side and a tiny painting of Jackson on the other. The past and present united, just as she had found a way to honor her origins while embracing the life she had chosen. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the expanded porch watching their children play in the yard, Jackson took her hand, his touch as cherished as it had been that first tentative evening by the fire. Any regrets? He asked, a question he posed each year on this day. Not one, Lee replied truthfully. Every step, even the painful ones, led me here. How could I regret that? Jackson's fingers brushed against the locket resting at the hollow of her throat. I've always wondered that day at the auction if I hadn't been there. But you were, she said simply. That's all that matters. The locket that had once symbolized all she had lost now represented everything she had gained, not despite her struggles, but because of them. The girl who had been sold with a locket she refused to remove had found, in the most unlikely of places, the man who never asked her to take it off. And in that acceptance, she had found not just love, but the freedom to choose it for herself.